Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm going to continue today with my series, Development Theories of the Gospels Are All Bunk. I just finished a portion of that on Jesus' Passion narratives, and now I'm moving on to the resurrection narratives. Today I'm going to talk about the misuse of the Gospel of Mark in a development theory about the resurrection stories of Jesus. Now, Mark is very dependably used in this argument. You get any skeptic talking about this, and the supposed development of the resurrection narratives is getting more and more involved as you go further along in time. And every time they will turn to Mark and they'll say, there are no resurrection stories in Mark. It just ends, the women run away, and they don't say anything to anybody because they're terrified, they're afraid. That's Mark, and it's the earliest gospel, and it's the shortest gospel, and look at that. And then you move on to Matthew and Luke, and you have appearance stories, right, where Jesus appears and talks to people. Makes you think, huh? Okay, so there's this strong implication that there's something evidentially very significant about the lack of resurrection appearance narratives in the Gospel of Mark. There are three assumptions that characterize that use. The first is probably true, in my opinion. The second is, I would say, probably false, arguably false. And the third is definitely false. So I'm going to go through those three assumptions about Mark in order to show how this use of Mark is completely illicit in a development theory of the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. So the first assumption that I think is probably true is that the longer ending of Mark that we have printed in a lot of our Bibles, but in the modern translations it's sort of usually marked off in brackets, is probably not original to the Gospel of Mark. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm saying here. I'm not saying it's non-historical. Something can be non-canonical, but still be historical. I think that's probably the case with the story of the woman caught in adultery. That I think it's a true story that happened, but I don't think it was written as part of John's Gospel originally. And the same could easily be true here, that everything said there, several of these things are just summaries of the appearance stories that we find in the other Gospels, including John, for that matter, happened like that. Even the words of Jesus about, treading on snakes and so forth, could be historical. So I'm not saying it's not historical, but I'm saying I don't think it was written by Mark as part of his original gospel. Now, every time I say this, someone says, have you read this book that argues that it is original? I have not read the book. Those of you who've shared it with me know what I'm talking about. I'm not despising that. I'm not saying I couldn't have my mind changed. That's just an apportionment of my time. And for right now, the argument seems to me pretty strong that that longer ending was not part of Mark's original gospel. Okay. Next assumption that a skeptic or a critical scholar will make when using this as part of a development argument. The Gospel of Mark originally ended there. Boom. They ran away. They didn't say anything to anybody. They were afraid. Wow. Now, I want to say that whether you're reading it in English or when scholars discuss it in, Greek and the Greek of that, the ending is like running into a brick wall. Da-dum, 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 bam. Okay? It is so abrupt. And there have been scholarly discussions and arguments about whether you ever find a sentence that's ended with that particular word. Evidently, they have found some sentences that do end with that word, But then they ever found a book that ends with that word? Evidently not. But aside from that esoteric aspect of those discussions, the abruptness of the ending is undeniable. That, it just seems like there should be something more to it. In fact, some of the very same properties that make the existing longer ending not fit are data points that point to the idea that there was some other ending before. And what I mean by that is the fact that it's narrating, blow by blow, what's happening to the women, and then stops, and then in the longer ending it switches to kind of a, the first person who saw him was Mary Magdalene, like more of a summary of various events. That's part of what makes that longer ending not look authentic, because it doesn't seem to fit together. But by that same token, since he is narrating what's happening to the women, the question is, why doesn't he end in some more rounded off, smoother fashion? Even, and later that day they spoke to the apostles or something like that. And they rejoiced because Jesus was risen. The end, something, right? So that very abrupt change of style is also an argument that there was originally something else there. So to me, the appearance of the data is that there was some other ending that was lost originally. So I think the skeptical assumption, or anybody's assumption, that it ended there are non-skeptics who hold that as well, is probably false. But now let's go to the worst one, which is the third assumption, which is not only is the longer ending inauthentic, not only did the Gospel of Mark end there at verse 8, but there's something evidentially important about that is contrary to the presence of the resurrection stories in the other Gospels. Now, this is where it gets really epistemologically highly dubious, because this is not just an argument from silence. This is one of the worst kinds of arguments from silence, which is the argument from silence against evidence. Okay, so, and I'm often saying this, if I have no evidence at all that there has been a massive accident out on a street nearby, I'm not going to just go randomly believing, hey, I bet there's been a massive evidence right out there at that corner. Okay? Not just going to believe something in the total absence of evidence. But if one member of my family comes back and tells me, man, there was this huge accident out on Cork Street, and another member of my family who was also out driving comes back and talks about other things and doesn't mention the accident, I'm not going to use the second family member's silence to undermine the first family member's testimony. That would be irresponsible. That's using an argument from silence against evidence. And that's exactly what they're doing here. They're using their other assumption that this is where it ended, and then they're ratcheting that up further, that there's some great significance to this, so that the fact that there are resurrection appearances in the other Gospels must mean that they're more developed. So this, again, is this notion of evolution. It's this weird evolutionary model applied to documents, that the shorter document is the earlier, the more primitive, and in some sense the more true, and then that, they get bigger as you go on. I probably won't use this for this video. I'll probably do it for the next one. I want to find a thumbnail of the horse evolution, where the horse is really small and then it gets bigger as time goes on. Now, why else is this a dubious argument? It's not just that it's one of the worst kinds of arguments from silence that there are. It's also because Mark's gospel itself would already count as developed in the eyes of the skeptic. So Mark is just being used as a stick with which to beat Matthew, Luke, and John. It's like a divide and conquer strategy. Okay, a skeptical scholar doesn't believe that a young man in white actually was there inside the empty tomb, as Mark reports, and said to the women, you know, he's not here, he's risen, as he said, you know, go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of them into Galilee, etc., and gave them this message. I mean, that's clearly supposed to be a supernatural messenger of some kind, even though he's referred to as a young man in white. I mean, come on, you know, it doesn't use the word angel, but he's clearly supposed to be an angel. Well, that, if you're a skeptic, you think that was made up. So what exactly is the point supposed to be here? It's like gossip, right? Well, you know, I saw her coming out of his house. Makes you think, right? And you don't come right out and say what you're insinuating. Well, you know, Mark doesn't have any resurrection appearances. Huh, makes you think. It's like, spit it out. What are you getting at? Are you saying that Mark was historically scrupulous and that he said, well, I'll include a made-up angel, but I draw the line at including made-up appearance stories? No, of course. They don't think that the angel was something that Mark's historical conscience allowed him to include, even though it was a historical embellishment, but that his historical conscience was sensitive, and so he wouldn't include resurrection stories as embellishments. It's just a sort of a contentless insinuation from the absence of the resurrection narratives, supposedly in Mark, for the dubiousness of the resurrection narratives in Matthew, Luke, and John. But they can't really spell out any reason why that should be so. Making matters worse, Mark's story actually leads you to expect resurrection narratives. So it can't be that Mark didn't include resurrection stories because he had no idea that Jesus ever was thought to have appeared to anyone. On the contrary, okay, in verse 7, the angel actually says to them, okay, he's not here, that's why it's empty, right? He's gone, implying a physical resurrection. The body's gone. Okay, second, he's going ahead of you to Galilee. Take this message. So that suggests physical movement, right? I mean, if Jesus is just up in heaven and he's just going to give them visions or something, you know, you don't travel, right? This suggests traveling on the earth from the vicinity of Jerusalem to Galilee. So you guys go to Galilee, and you're going to see him there, as he predicted. And that refers back to Mark itself. In Mark 14, Jesus says, you know, you're all going to scatter, but after I'm risen, I'll go before you into Galilee. So it's tying that together. It's anticipating some kind of physical encounter between Jesus and the disciples in a specific physical location, which is different from the physical location where the angel is speaking to the women at the moment. So why in the world would you think that Mark is knowingly, deliberately excluding resurrection stories because he doesn't think they happened, or he knows they were added, or he knows they were embellishments? If that was how he thought, why would he include this? So we have to make the skeptic spell out what he is saying, and then see whether that fits with the text that we have. And that message of the angel is before the longer ending. There's no question about the canonicity there. So that third assumption, and that is really sort of an insinuation of evidential significance against the other Gospels, is completely wrong, completely bogus, and at odds with the text of Mark itself, even prior to the long ending. So that's the illicit use of Mark to try to jumpstart a development theory of the resurrection stories. Next time, I'm going to be talking about the comparison among the other three Gospels, which actually narrate Jesus meeting people, and we have those narratives. Mark may have narrated that as well, but if so, that's been lost. But we actually have those, and see how the development claim stands up between Matthew, Luke, and John. And spoiler, it doesn't stand up well at all. So thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. Please come back next time to the Lydia Migrant channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.